I will explain the process from the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. In this issue, I will explain the Nomonhan Incident. The Nomonhan Incident was a military conflict that resulted from a border dispute between Manchukuo, the Soviet Union, and Mongolia. This was an important battle that changed Japan's subsequent war strategy. In the previous article, I explained the circumstances surrounding the start of the war in the First Nomonhan Incident. This time, I will start with the Second Nomonhan Incident. In the First Nomonhan Incident, which began in May 1939, the Kwantung Army challenged the Soviet mechanized army with an infantry-based force and suffered a painful defeat. The Kwantung Army concealed the fact that the troops led by Lieutenant Colonel Higashi had been wiped out, and sent a telegram to the General Staff that they had surrounded the enemy and dealt a heavy blow. Believing this report, the General Staff sent a congratulatory telegram to the Kwantung Army congratulating them on their victory. In April 1939, a key figure in the Japanese puppet government of the Provisional Government of the Republic of China was assassinated in the British concession in Tianjin. The Japanese government demanded that the perpetrator be extradited to the United Kingdom, but was denied. As a result, the Japanese military imposed traffic restrictions in the British and French concessions in June 1939, and relations with both countries deteriorated. Under these circumstances, the Japanese government did not want to aggravate the problems with the Soviets caused by the Kwantung Army. Therefore, the Imperial Japanese Army was reluctant to reinforce its forces against the Kwantung Army. What, on the other hand, was the Soviet military's response? The Soviets dispatched Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, a hero of the later German-Soviet War, to Mongolia to observe the First Nomonhan Incident with the mission of identifying problems with the Soviet military. Zhukov watched the battle, severely denounced the lack of preparation and operational ability of the Soviet military top brass, and reported this to Stalin. Upon receiving this report, Stalin dismissed Fiklenko, the commander of the Soviet forces, and appointed Zhukov as the new commander of the corps. Stalin then decided to send more forces to Mongolia than Zhukov had requested. Behind Stalin's decision was information he received from a Soviet spy, Richard Sorge. He reported that the Japanese army needed a radical reorganization and that it would take 2 years to make this change. Therefore, he said, the time when the Japanese army would be able to wage war against us would be in 1941. It is said that Stalin intended to deal a heavy blow to Japan before Japan was ready for war. Thus, the Soviets reflected on the First Nomonhan Incident, deciding to make an emergency personnel reshuffle and to send a large force into Mongolia for the next battle. In response, the Kwantung Army did not hold Kometsubara guilty of underestimating the enemy and suffering defeat without dispatching the appropriate forces. They also showed warm consideration for Yamagata, who had been reprimanded by Kometsubara for abandoning Azuma, and allowed him to remain in his post. Soviet Zhukov first tried to rebuild the Soviet Air Force, which was completely outmatched by the skilled Japanese Air Force. Zhukov asked Moscow to send skilled flight officers to the Soviet Union and had them thoroughly retrain the airmen. Once their training was complete, Zhukov ordered the Air Force to bomb Japanese bases on June 18. On June 20, Zhukov ordered his army to launch a sortie as well, and 200 soldiers, including tanks, attacked the Japanese quarters. Kometsubara, commander of the 23rd Division, was looking for an opportunity to fight again, and he insisted on a thorough resistance against the Soviet attack. Colonel Terada, head of the Kwantung Army's Operations Division, insisted that the Japanese government should wait and see until the problem with the British, which the Japanese government was currently having difficulty dealing with, was resolved. However, Tsuji, a lower-ranked general staff officer, vehemently disagreed, saying that if we left Nomonhan unattended, the Soviet forces would take advantage of our weak posture and advance further. I am confident that we can defeat the Soviet forces. In the end, General Ueda, commander of the Kwantung Army, adopted the opinion of Kometsubara and Tsuji and decided to fight the Soviets. General Tsuji, the chief of staff, was planning to fight the Soviets with a large force, including the 7th Army in addition to the 23rd Army. However, Ueda, the commander, said that the army in charge of Nomonhan was the 23rd Army. If I were Kometsubara of the 23rd Army, I would be so ashamed that I would commit seppuku when I learned that reinforcements were coming. He opposed the dispatch of the 7th Army. Ueda respected Kometsubara's face more than the war situation. He did not take advantage of the lesson that Kometsubara had learned in the First Nomonhan Incident, when he had wiped out the Eastern Corps by outflanking the war effort. Doi, a military officer stationed in Moscow, heard that the Kwantung Army was preparing for war with the Soviets and informed the Kwantung Army that the Soviets were transporting large numbers of soldiers and weapons to the Far East. However, the Kwantung Army silenced the information. On June 22, a large formation of 150 Soviet aircraft crossed the border, and the Japanese Air Force also sortied, resulting in a large-scale air battle. Again, the Japanese were overwhelmingly victorious, shooting down 48 Soviet aircraft, while the Japanese lost only 4. The Kwantung Army, feeling threatened by the active activities of the Soviet Air Force, decided to bomb Tomsk, a Soviet air base in Mongolian territory. However, since the General Staff headquarters in Tokyo prohibited attacks on Soviets across the border, the Kwantung Army decided to carry out the attack in secret from the General Staff headquarters. This clandestine bombing became known to the General Staff just prior to the sortie, and they sent a telegram requesting a halt to the operation. However, the Kwantung Army ignored this request and proceeded to bomb the area. The bombing was a success, and the Kwantung Army reported to the General Staff headquarters that it had destroyed nearly 150 planes. This report infuriated the General Staff, and the conflict between the Kwantung Army and the General Staff became serious. When the Showa Emperor heard about this, he was angered and said that some sort of action should be taken against the leadership of the Kwantung Army. In response, the General Staff said that it would take action after the incident was over. This lenient attitude on the part of the General Staff allowed the Kwantung Army to run alone. By this time, it had become known to the General Staff that the man running the Kwantung Army was Major Tsuji, the Chief of Staff. The General Staff requested that Major Tsuji be removed from his post, but Seijiro Itagaki, the Minister of War, was fond of Tsuji and refused the request. Tsuji continued to be at the center of the movement of the Kwantung Army. Tsuji drew up a plan to cross the border and encircle and annihilate the Soviet forces. The attack was led by Kometsubara's 23rd Army, a large force of 22,000 men, including Manchurian troops. And it included 2 tank regiments. This was the first time in history that such a large tank force had been deployed in a battlefield. The Kwantung Army General Staff considered it a large force, as exaggerated as using a cattle knife to kill a chicken. In fact, Zhukov's tank force consisted of 17,000 infantrymen, 180 tanks, and 270 armored vehicles, a mechanized force that outnumbered the Japanese. Tsuji had planned to have tank units cross the Halha River to the rear of the Soviet forces. However, Kometsubara of the 23rd Army was concerned that they were not equipped with enough tanks to cross the river. The Harua River was reported to be more than 1 meter deep, making it impossible for tanks to cross the river alone. Tsuji tried to persuade Kometsubara, who was reluctant to cross the Harua River, to go ahead with the operation, but as expected, it was impossible for tanks to cross. Tsuji attempted to cross the river with infantry only and encircle the enemy's rear. On June 30th, tank units of both the Japanese and Soviet armies engaged in battle for the first time. The Japanese, who had the advantage in aircraft, could not match the performance of the Soviets in tanks. A tank commander stated that the enemy tanks were superior to those of his unit, and that the enemy tanks were of much higher quality than he had imagined. On July 2nd, troops led by Yamagata, who had been accused of fighting passively in the First Nomonhan Incident, attacked Soviet troops located on the eastern bank of the Kalka River. The Soviet artillery unit opened a strong artillery barrage on the Yamakata unit, and the Yamakata unit was prevented from advancing. The Japanese troops, who had only been dealing with Chinese soldiers, felt a fear they had never experienced before at the ferocious bombardment by the Soviet troops. The tank unit led by Yasuoka was no match for the Soviet tanks, and deciding that an attack during the daytime was impossible, they conducted a night attack with tanks for the first time in history. The night attack was successful, and the tanks were able to break through deep into the Soviet lines. Although the Soviets had 5 times as many tanks and armored vehicles as the Japanese still had the numerical advantage in the battle in early July. As was the case in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese preferred an aggressive offensive, while the Soviets preferred to fight while defending their positions. On July 3, Japanese tanks launched a frontal attack on Soviet positions. The Japanese tanks were blocked by the Soviet defenses, which had skillfully constructed anti-tank positions, and came under intensive fire from the Soviets. Although the Japanese soldiers were surprised by the Soviets' high-performance tanks and field guns, they destroyed a total of 60 enemy tanks and armored vehicles and retreated, unable to capture the enemy positions. Japanese tanks were thinly armored and easily penetrated by shells, but because they were diesel-powered vehicles, they did not catch fire when hit by bullets and most were able to continue fighting. The Japanese losses were 20 tanks and armored vehicles. With the losses on this day, the Japanese were no longer in a position to mount an offensive with tanks. The Soviets further increased their forces and attacked the Japanese tanks. Based on the experience of this battle, the tanks attacked the Soviet tanks with only the barrels of their guns on the ridge of the hill. Although overwhelmingly outclassed by the performance of the enemy tanks and main guns, the Japanese soldiers were superior in terms of the skill level of their soldiers. One after another, the Japanese tanks hit the Soviet tanks with a barrage of hits. However, the Soviets were outnumbered, and by July 9, the Japanese tank corps had increased its complete tank losses to 30 tanks. Fearing the complete loss of their valuable tank regiments, the Kwantung Army ordered the tank corps to withdraw completely. While the tank battle was taking place, an infantry unit led by Major General Kobayashi was about to cross the Halha River and encircle Zhukov's corps. Zhukov, seeing the Japanese tank force outflanking him, mistakenly believed that the main Japanese force was a tank unit and turned many mechanized units against the Japanese tank force. Zhukov did not anticipate that his infantry would cross the Kalka River and engage in a siege, and Kobayashi's infantry succeeded in crossing the river without resistance from the Soviets. Zhukov had not conducted sufficient reconnaissance activities and was completely unaware of the Japanese army's movements. Upon learning of the Japanese crossing, Zhukov immediately ordered his tank units to attack the Japanese. It was a battle between infantry and tank units on a vast steppe. Based on the lessons learned from the First Nomonhan Incident, Kobayashi had organized a determined meat attack team. Their weapon of choice was the Molotov cocktail. It was no longer a battle between armies, but more like a battle between security forces and the people. Japanese soldiers approached Soviet tanks and threw Molotov cocktails. Soviet tanks, which had been burning hot from long runs in the hot sun, easily burst into flames, and soldiers who emerged from the tanks were shot to death. Even tanks are surprisingly fragile without infantry support. Zhukov understood at this point that the Japanese had crossed the river with a large force. Zhukov had only mechanized troops on hand, and infantry and artillery had not yet arrived on the scene. Soviet military regulations dictated that no tank operations should be conducted without infantry support. However, Zhukov decided to break this rule and attack the Japanese with only mechanized units at hand. On July 3, tank units without infantry support were blown up one after another by Kobayashi's infantry, which had only field artillery, Molotov cocktails, and mines. The Soviets lost 77 tanks and 36 armored vehicles in a single day in an attack that took no account of losses. However, Kobayashi's infantry could no longer afford to advance because of this attack. Kobayashi's infantry was split apart by the Soviet tank units, and each unit fought separately, inflicting heavy casualties. Tsuji, a Kwantung Army General Staff officer who had come to the front, saw the Soviet attack with no regard for losses and thought, "The enemy will surely increase their strength and attack our army tomorrow." He advised Kometsubara, commander of the 23rd Division, to withdraw. Kometsubara adopted his dedication and ordered a retreat. Above all, Kobayashi's infantry crossed the river on a single small bridge, which, if destroyed, would have threatened to cut off their retreat completely. On July 4, Kobayashi's troops began to retreat. However, Zhukov did not have the strength to pursue them, and on July 5, Kobayashi's troops completed their full retreat. In this battle, the casualties were 800 out of Kobayashi's 8,000 troops. This was the first half of the Second Nomonhan Incident. The next article will discuss the second half of the Second Nomonhan Incident.